All right, well, welcome to the last one before the keynote, so got to end on a good note too, right? We need to talk. This is Daniel Ludvigson from Long Prairie Great Eagle Public Schools. And that's him, and if you guys need anything, my name's Hunter Felt. I'm a MSBA board member, so hosting the room, so I'll be sitting up front if you need anything. Definitely feel free to come and bug me. It's all over to you.
Thank you. So this presentation is about those times when you have a tough conversation where emotions are high, consequences are typically significant, and there's a high chance that it might be recorded. And we all have to give each other a bit of grace, and sometimes that involves both you and the other person. And I'm going to go over a bunch of strategies, and a lot of their focus is to get people talking, so you understand their point of view, and that from that point you can work on solutions. Because a lot of times when our emotions get heightened, we don't actually talk about what we're mad about. We just kind of go after the person, in my experience. And I have a fair amount of experience with that, to be honest. So these, the two books on top for sure, and then the bottom one's more geared towards administrators and evaluations, but Crucial Accountability and Crucial Conversation, they're the only books I have read like 3 times. They are very effective on how to have a conversation and hold people accountable, so I highly recommend them. So that's where a lot of my resources come from, as well as personal experience navigating this. So before the conversation even starts, these 4 things are very important, because usually when a conversation goes awry, one of these 4 things is missing. One is a sense of safety. If somebody doesn't feel safe, they're not going to have an honest conversation with you. Maybe they won't have any conversation with you. They will probably tell you things like, you're just going to go and tell somebody this, doesn't pay to tell you anything, or just nothing at all. And then respect. Respect is the sense that like your knowledge or expertise is being respected. And that's definitely one that you're not going to be able to patch in a single conversation. But like in particular, if you're in a conversation where somebody feels like they have special knowledge and that their opinion is it's being ignored, they're going to feel like a respect issue. And then purpose. I like to think that purpose, if you're working for a school district, should be the easy one. We're here for kids. Always go back to we're here for kids, because almost every problem I've run into is when we stop focusing on that. I'll get more into that, but like, if you're at home with your spouse, there might be a different purpose involved. But if you sense that you have different goals in mind, it's often a source of conflict. And last is trust. Obviously, trust involves, can I trust what you say? But it also has a component of predictability. So when you say something, do you follow through on it? When a problem is brought to you, do you respond to it in a predictable or unpredictable manner? That's also a part of trust. And this stuff all plays a role even before you have a conversation. You can establish purpose during a conversation. You can work on creating a safe place. But that trust and respect, like you can give some of it in the conversation, but if you've already pulled from the piggy bank, so to speak, like that's a little more of an uphill battle. So before you ever have a conversation, good relationships matter. So one of the things is identifying that you are going into a crucial conversation. And the book uses this little diagram here. But opposing opinions, that one's pretty obvious. You don't agree on something. I think you can flip on the news and see what happens when people have strong opposing opinions. High stakes. And some of this is a little bit more perception. Like you might not agree that it's high stakes, but if the person believes it's high stakes, to them it's a crucial conversation. So, what curriculum you pick for your school, one person may feel like is the difference between significant growth and the other one like more of the same, and assuming that's bad. And then strong emotions, and that one in particular is more based on the person. I remember one conversation where to me, the stakes weren't high. I didn't have a significantly different opinion. But to them, and what it was they felt like it was very much a respect issue. It was about like a student paying for some damages. And they were like very upset. And for them, it was a crucial conversation. I think you can agree, if I handled it wrong, I could have created a bigger problem than just, $10 for a damaged device. So this is the part of the presentation where I like to stop. I've talked to a lot of people and I've written a lot of things, and a lot of times people will just be sitting there and they'll be like, I know somebody that could really use this advice. And I am sure you do, but you can't make them listen. So the first thing you need to do, which is also a part of keeping your sanity for the record, is focus on you. Because if you get wrapped up in trying to control what other people are doing, from personal experience, people are very hard to get to do what you want them to do. But you can control how you're handling the situation. So first off, our brains are wired to have the, when adrenaline pumps, we have the fight, flight, or freeze response. I think you can all agree that none of those will help you in this conversation. So instead of your brain kind of accessing the higher functions and being able to think more logically, you're biologically programmed to become more primitive and like, me right, you wrong. I appreciate laughter. You get a better presentation then, because I don't get so anxious. So focus on what you really want. A lot of times we go wrong because our emotions are high, and then we go in and we don't actually talk about what we're upset about. I remember a parent calling me once because they were upset their child got suspended, detention. And he called me and he was going on and like, hey, if this was my other child, you would have suspended him and you would have done this and that. His one child I was very familiar with. His other child I wasn't. And you can kind of probably figure out why that was. And I said, pause. Are you advocating that I suspend your kid? He was like, well, no. I'm like, okay, let's back up. And what his concern was that there was differing treatment. And then we talked through it, and it was a progressive discipline model. And if I had responded to what he said that he wanted to talk about, we would have been way off in left field. What's your role? So be very careful of your own thoughts. So a lot of times when we know we're going to engage in something that's probably not going to help the situation, we'll say things to ourselves like, this is the only way. They never listen. I got to rail into them, or nobody's going to do anything. And if you find yourself speaking in a lot of absolutes or this or that thinking, like, is that true? Stop and say, like, is this really this or that? And chances are everything has a lot of gray. And if you get stuck in that thinking, you usually make bad choices. So another thing that can often happen is you get sidetracked by the most obvious issue, and that may sound a little off, but like say you're arguing with your spouse about going out to a movie or staying home, and the real issue is you want to spend time together. But how many of you think that the conversation could easily end up all about going to the movie and a big fight about that, and you haven't actually talked anything about what you're actually mad about? And so be careful not to, and what happens then is you talk about that specific issue in such detail, but that specific issue isn't the problem, it's the pattern. And so you're not really talking about what you're really concerned about, that you never spend any time together, and like, let's say for this situation, every time you try to, you get excuses or whatever. Instead, you're talking about one instance, and I can tell you people are really good at coming up with 101 excuses for why they did that one thing. And it often is just much more effective to be like, hey, this keeps happening. And then frame it from that perspective. And try not to get bogged down in little details, because usually you're not going to get anywhere. So, continuing on, master your own stories, as the book calls it that. First off, you make you mad. And so I have kind of a funny story that goes with that. They were doing this research and they told different people this story. And they're like, you go into a bank and there's a robbery and you get shot. And they had 3 responses. One response was, what bad luck, I was at the bank and I got shot. Pretty reasonable. Another one was, what good luck, I only got shot. No, I didn't die. So there's a perspective on that. And the last one was, there were so many more people who deserve to get shot in this. Well, I like that one because it's the same situation, right? And if you're telling yourself the story like, why didn't they get shot? You're the one making yourself mad. And one thing to check is if you are feeling very strong of feelings about something, you will act on it in some way. And keep in mind that applies to the people around you. So if you kind of repress them, mask them, avoid it, people can tell it bothers you. And that usually is what leads into that you said that thing that you wish you didn't. So acknowledge that the issue is important to you and that you need to address it. But just take time to get your thoughts together. Get back to the facts. And so when we tell ourselves a story, we usually invent details. You're stuck in traffic and somebody's honking at you and you're thinking, that person is just this big jerk. They go around yelling at people. Maybe the person is trying to get to the hospital and they're just not handling their emotions well. The story you told yourself is why you're mad. And how many of you know people that as they invent details, that they start acting like they're facts? So it's important to recognize, A, when you're doing it, and sometimes to stop people and be like, well, how do you know that? How did you come to that conclusion? And we'll talk more about that later. Own your own role. Again, you're the only person you can control. And usually, there's 2 sides to every story. Maybe you're contributing in some way, and I'll talk more about those things later. But recognize what your contribution is. Make sure that you have yourself right before you go in the conversation. Sometimes we like to ignore our contribution and we get good and upset. Consider what a decent, rational person, why they would do that. Because most of the time when you get really wound up, how many of you are thinking about how irrational and unreasonable this person is? I think quite a bit of us are. And I'm not saying those people don't exist, by the way. But it's very constructive to try to think of why a reasonable person might act the way they're acting. Know what you hope to accomplish. So I'll use teacher evaluations as an example, or for your situation like superintendent. If somebody's struggling, is it constructive to go in there and give them a laundry list of every single thing you have a problem with? Or is it more constructive to focus on a few things that they can change and get better at? So a lot of times we go wrong because we forget what we're trying to accomplish and we get wrapped up in either trying to win the conversation or we just kind of veer off track. And so sometimes you need to pause and be like, okay, I'm going to have this conversation. What am I hoping the person will do? Is my approach going to get me closer to that goal? Or am I actually setting myself up for failure? Okay, these are things to work on before the conversation. I'll just deal with it flickering. First, we work on you first. You're the only person you can control. If you are in a good state of mind, you will handle the situation better. Focus on what you really want. And we talked a little bit about that. It's really important. It's easy to actually not address the issue you're trying to address. But refuse the fool's choice. I touched on it briefly, but what the book calls the fool choice is like when you tell yourself, I have to do this or something else. It's usually absolute thinking or extreme thinking that you're telling yourself that your course of action that you want to go on is justified because it's the only way. Usually that type of thinking is problematic and you're not going to see the solution in front of you. So be careful of the fool's choice. Spot signs the conversation has become critical. So when you're communicating with the person, pay attention to their body language, pay attention to their word choices. A lot of this process is an engagement back and forth. So if you're in the conversation and the person's turning red, they're raising their volume, you're going to need to respond to that differently than if they are remaining calm. Don't be afraid to pause the conversation if it's veering off track. Safety is at risk. The big thing about these strategies is you're trying to understand where the person's at so you can come to a resolution, so you can talk through it and solve the problem. A lot of times, people will not talk, they will not share their real opinions if they feel like their safety is at risk. And that's a perception thing. People's idea of why they're not safe vary, and sometimes they're not based on a lot of reality, but you have to create that space. I'll use a student example. I had a student once that was in the office a lot, and he'd come in, sit down, go like this, and be like, just tell me what I have to do. You're not going to listen to me anyway. And I use these strategies, and eventually when he came in, he'd get down and we'd talk about what he did, and I'd say, like, if you did something wrong, we'll address it. If you didn't do something wrong, then we'll address that. But I'm here to listen. And that made a pretty big difference. I still saw him a lot. But he knew that I would take the time, because on a separate note, if somebody's in trouble a lot, I think you can agree you tend to start assuming that they're always in trouble. And that's not a good place to be emotionally. Okay, I have a scenario for you. Something to think through using these strategies, but I'm pretty sure you'll be able to relate to this. Your school board just had a split 3-3 vote on a controversial motion about a program that's popular with some families but poses financial risks for the district. One board member abstained, saying they needed more information. During the meeting, you notice that this member seems disengaged, checking their phone, whispering with another board member, and appearing frustrated as you explain the budget details. Afterward, you overheard them say, "I just don't trust the numbers we're being given." The next morning, they post on social media. That makes everybody excited, right? We owe our taxpayers transparency and accountability. Decisions shouldn't be rushed when questions haven't been fully answered. They didn't name you, but the timing and message clearly point your way. Soon the community members are sharing the post, and staff start asking if something is wrong between the board and administration. You now have to decide whether to address the situation publicly, reach out privately, or let it go. So, watch for safety is at risk. It's very important for you to watch how your message is being received, because some things can happen. During some conversations, somebody might tell you it's fine, it's okay, and I had a parent once who was doing that while they were turning a bright shade of red. And I'll talk about that later, but that's not fine, and if you barrel ahead because it's easier, you've lost an opportunity. If somebody's escalating, then you need to make sure that you make a good choice. Like, again, don't be afraid to pause the conversation, because sometimes we need time for those chemicals in our brain to lower. A lot of times when I was a principal and somebody was sent to the office, I would tell them I would deal with them after I finished checking emails, which a lot of times I did have one, but sometimes I was just waiting for them to look a little bit calmer before we started talking. So you want to make sure that you know how your message is being received. Pay attention, is their body language lining up with what they're saying? Because if it's not, you're probably not getting their honest opinion. And pay attention to word choices, and if you're in a real tense one where you're taking notes, write exact word choices down. You might paraphrase it later. But the reason to do that is, it might reveal what the person's issue really is. If they're using a lot of words that hint at a safety issue, if they're deflecting a lot of things off, they probably feel vulnerable. But they might not tell you the real issue, but if you pay attention to where they keep trying to direct your conversation, you might understand, it might give you a clue as to what's going on. What signs are you familiar with that tell you that a conversation's going off the rails? Anybody willing to share?
Elevation of voice, volume.
Yep. Volume, tone,
Folded arms.
folded arms.
Just shutting down and not talking.
Yep.
Accusations.
Yep. And quick caveat, we're really good at reading that body language isn't lining up with what's being said, but we're not as good at telling why. So sometimes we're like, they're lying, and like I said, like something's probably amiss, but be careful of jumping to conclusions, because we're better at reading that something's amiss than we are interpreting the why. Technology's arguing with me. There we go. So these are some things that happen when a conversation is getting critical. A lot of times we move to silence or violence, and a lot of times that depends on you and the circumstances. A lot of us have a leaning that will do more so one than the other. And I'll say in silence, usually you are worried about safety, or that you don't think you're going to be listened to or nothing's going to happen. And violence a lot of times comes back to you feel personal vulnerability, or you feel like no one's going to listen unless you get really loud. A lot of times these are, if you treat them as symptoms, it can help you navigate the conversation. So masking is pretty simple. That's a wonderful idea. Now I'm going to go back to my room and ignore everything you said. That never happens, right? Avoiding. How many of you have had the pleasure of being out, having a nice stroll in the public, and somebody walks across the street and avoids you very, very purposely? Yeah, I won't say I've never done that, but avoiding is they just either change the topic, avoid the person entirely. Usually you're afraid that you can't solve the issue then anyway. Withdrawing, that's just shutting down, you're quiet, you're like, okay, fine. And that's one you have to be careful with, because it can be tempting to be like, all right, you said you're fine, we're just going to barrel ahead. But, a lot of times if you do that, you're going to miss something that's going on. Violence, controlling. Maybe the person starts dominating the conversation, they won't let you get a word in edgewise. You need to do this or else. They basically try to like be in charge of the conversation and not really let the other person do anything with it. Labeling is things like, you're from that department doesn't know anything, so your idea is dumb. Like you slap a label on it to justify why you don't like it, but like if you start asking the person like, well, okay, what's wrong with the idea? It usually is easy to poke holes up because they don't really have an explanation. They're just saying it's dumb because you're part of this group. And attacking, that's the one that I think as board members you've all had the misfortune of being on the receiving end of somebody pointing at you, calling you names. And again, if you're able to kind of treat it as a symptom, sometimes it helps you from escalating. Because a lot of times people are going to respond to your body language. And a strategy I have used sometimes is I'll start engaging in the person and then I'll start lowering my voice. Because it's natural to mimic the other person. And so sometimes I can get the other person to lower the voice. And it has a nice side effect is usually you have to lean in to listen. And that causes a little bit of a pause in the response. So fun little fact there. Okay, toolkits. So again, it's very important in this presentation that you understand that you want to get the person talking. You want to develop a shared understanding. And at the end of the day, you're going to make better decisions, better judgments. And if you can handle the big conversations well, that's more important because like if you only handle little conversations well, you're not going to get real far. I think you can agree. Because as soon as you hit a big roadblock, you're not going to be able to work through it. So first, apologize for whatever role you might have played. And you have to be honest. So if you're really not like sorry, don't throw one out there just to make sure you check the box. And kind of the variation I've also used is ownership. And maybe you're not apologizing, but you'll acknowledge that you did this. And you guys are often in situations where there's charged opinions, and so you'll have to use some judgment. Sometimes you don't want to just say you're at fault for something because of the circumstances, but you can still say, I did this, and I acknowledge that you're responding to it that way.
Does that... I was in a situation where we had to make an unpopular cut. I'm not sorry that I did it because we had to do it. So how can you convey You're sorry that you had to make the cut, but you're not sorry for what you did.
That is a great question. A lot of times I would start with initially acknowledging that it's very upsetting for you, and I understand that, and that it was a hard decision. Talk about your stance on it. We had to weigh this and this, and I had to be a part of that, and we had to make a decision. I realized that, whatever reason that you're upset about this, but it had to be made. Now, it will probably tell you that's not really an apology, I'll be honest. But you're still saying that you acknowledge that it happened and it's upsetting. Because what you're really trying to do is saying that, I'm listening. And a lot of these strategies you kind of go back and forth on depending on the person and their response. But that would be one where I wouldn't apologize. I would say we had to make this decision and we had to weigh these things. And I understand that you might have a different opinion, but I did what I thought was best for students, type of thing. I'm not saying that will make them happy with you. Does that answer your question?
That's what I expected.
It's
There's no
still
good
constructive.
There's no good answer.
Yeah. It's still constructive because if you respond to that way consistently over time, people will develop respect for you. And I think you guys all know you can't make people happy all the time. And if you are, you're probably not doing your job. So contrast might be good in that situation. They probably accuse you of something like, you don't care about, we'll just say, the ag department. And you're just going after it because you don't think there's a relevance to it. No, I very much support career technical education, but we can only pay for X amount of programs. I want people to have opportunities, but I also want the budget to be balanced, so I had to make a decision. Or a lot of you are board members. So as a board, we had to make a decision because we could only support these many programs. It's unfortunate one had to go by the wayside. So creating mutual purpose. That one is one that you can engage into a conversation. So with that person, depending on what their role is, you can try to go through this purpose. They call it CRIB, which is just an acronym to remember the different ways. So most often you're there for the kids and you want to provide opportunities. And if you know what's important to the person, you can start there and say, hey, I share that concern. Maybe you're approaching it differently. Recognize their purpose. Sometimes you have to invent it, you're too far off, and maybe you have to be a little creative about try to get what their purpose is, kind of compare it to what you're doing and see if there's a middle ground that you can form there. If you can get the person to a place, you might have to brainstorm a little bit or with a friend. Sometimes these conversations are multiple over time because, like I said, don't be afraid to pause them. Sometimes you need time to process, and it is hard to come up with some of this stuff on the spot. A lot of you are board members, so I often tell at my chair there in the back, hey, if I'm going off, kick me under the table. It's good to have a person that will do that. Be like, hey, just pause for a second. It is difficult. And it will take time to get good at it. And they are effective. They're not magic. But I really find purpose and mission is an effective thing to try to keep people coming back to. Why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? We might disagree on how to get there. But I'm not your enemy, basically is what you're trying to say.
How do you balance, because we're doing this for the kids, how do you balance when they retort back at you? Well, you say your priorities for the kids and you're affecting the kid.
That is a good question, and it's going to depend a lot on the situation. Can you make a statistic situation for me?
I'll go back to mine. The program was cut.
Is a student in the program?
Yes.
Okay. That is tough. That is tough. Okay, I appreciate that. It gives me a start. So sometimes that's a strategy is you tell the person these are the things that we had to do. And we had to make a decision because there's only a amount of resources. Do you have a clever addition to it? And it depends a little bit on who you're interacting with, because some people think they're smarter than they are. But sometimes if you can at least get them to understand what you had to weigh, you probably are not going to make that person happy. I'll be perfectly honest. Sorry.
You go first.
I mean, I feel like students will be affected either way, right? So if we don't have the funding for the majority of students because we keep a program that we can't, really, that we shouldn't be funding, it's going to affect more than just the few who were in that, program to begin with. So like
Gold
students
star.
will always be affected.
So that brings up a good point. I'm enjoying this dialogue. A lot of times it's good to find a person you trust and have them pretend to be who the person is, because in the moment you probably won't have a pocket answer for that unless you already know it's coming. And if you have a really smart friend trying to talk through that, they can be your person to try to invent the mutual ground. And again, sometimes you're not trying to make the person happy, but sometimes you're helping them understand that you have defensible ground. Like, you're not just doing this on a whim.
Been affecting more than just those 35 students who, like we have 2,500 students in our district. If we didn't cut and affect just those 35, we would have maybe been affecting 500 or 600 or 700 students. So the way I was approaching it with my constituents is that as an elected official, it is also my job to educate the community. So I was the treasurer at the time. I was on the finance committee. So I outlined, this is exactly how this process has gone. These are the things that have been cut. This is why 5th grade band is being cut and not choir and not orchestra. This is what happened. And I feel like people who are going to be mad are going to go off, right? No, do your thing. But the people who wanted to learn really appreciated that.
And those
that
people are
outline.
watching how you respond to the angry person.
Yes, exactly. So.
Can I add something too? I'm sorry. I also just
No,
feel
you're
like,
good. I like engagement.
well, people are allowed to feel angry.
Absolutely.
People are allowed to have feelings about a program being cut,
Absolutely.
right? So I think that it's on us to allow people to be human, right? And then we can be human as well by like letting them do that, and that's okay, right? Like
Absolutely.
It's okay for people to be upset.
Yeah, all feelings are valid. They can
Yeah.
be angry,
But this is happening.
but also like I can't help you here. Like and also at least in our situation.
So this is a great discussion. I know there's another question, but this is something that is a good strategy to use sometimes. Sometimes you let the person be mad at you, and you just let them keep talking, and you say, hey, tell me more, where are your feelings at? And it's not always fun, and it might lay into you, but sometimes it's the catharsis that gets them back down enough to have that conversation. And they will still probably be upset with you, but a lot of times people want to feel heard, and if you give them that much, you'll at least have done that. And so you have to practice a little bit, and that's why it's good to have a smart friend. But there are times where you just let the person rail into you, I'll be honest with you. Like, I'm not saying that you sit there and you let them call you names and different things, but like, if they're going on about the program and how it affects their kid and how it makes them feel, they want to tell somebody that. And it will benefit, it will help the relationship if you let them get through that. I'm not saying be a doormat or anything. Like, sometimes you have to tell, hey, you're being disrespectful. I'm more than happy to listen to you, but you need to bring the rhetoric down. But I will listen. There was a question over here.
No, I was just saying, sometimes you just have to be like, I understand you're upset. Or I understand why you're upset, or that you are upset.
And sometimes it becomes, what are other people going to see how you respond? I'll be honest. Sometimes people will watch how you respond, and if you calmly respond to that person who is lighting you up, they will talk about that. And it will gain you some respect. They might not gain you a pat on the back or an email, but it does matter.
Sorry, just one more comment. I think it's also very important when we're going back to people's feelings and their anger is to remember that anger is always a secondary emotion. You know, anybody who has a toddler in here, right? If they're throwing a tantrum, it's probably because they are scared, they are hungry, they need a nap. You know, so if somebody is really railing into you and they're you know, they're angry, it's really helpful to try to take that step back yourself and like, where is this anger coming from? Are you scared? Are you, you know, like, are you threatened? Like, what is it that's causing that anger? And try to go from there.
And that's where if you pay careful attention to the verbs and stuff they pick, sometimes you can sort out that, you know, they're afraid, or they're threatened, or they feel not listened to. Usually, it takes a while to be good at that. Yeah, it's not easy. I'm not here to say it is.
Just to piggyback off that, I usually deflect by, I just say, are you okay? And usually they're like, well, what do you mean? You know, yes, I understand you're upset about your child or whatever, but really, are you okay? And how have you been processing this? And then just try and listen to their emotion, because a lot of people don't understand, I mean, we probably do, but that if you're feeling that emotion, you've got to feel that emotion. You got to sit in that, feel it, and then the anger might go away. You might get a different outcome from the conversation. I usually don't say I'm sorry necessarily, because then that turns it back to yourself, the I'm sorry. I apologize, I understand, you know, but I mean, that's one trick that I usually use.
Yeah, any therapist will tell you the only way out is through, right? So you
Yeah.
gotta,
Yeah, just ask me through.
everybody should be in therapy.
Yeah.
So one strategy that I use is the active listening a lot, and I just want to challenge in a very respectful way the word understand, because if someone is angry and you had to make that hurt, you made them angry by a decision you made, you saying I understand you are upset may not always be received well, and so I lean towards I hear you saying that you are very upset because of X, Y, Z, and I cannot fully understand the hurt that I have caused through this decision. And by doing that, because I've had that I understand, I'm like, you don't understand.
You don't
It's like,
understand, no.
you do not understand what you have done by your actions. And so I just want to, it's a very minute detail, but I have found that it is received a bit better than the I understand.
I have used I respect your anger, or I respect your passion here.
Yes.
Let's talk more about it, like that, and that kind of gives them, I've noticed it gives them a little bit more power back, or they feel like they have a little bit of the power back. It's like, okay, yeah, I should be angry, you know, and then it gives them that opportunity to start that dialogue, right?
And it's a good point, and sometimes I'll use instead of like I understand or verbiage like that, because actually that is a very good point. Don't tell them you understand if you don't, but you can say I see you're upset. It looks like you want to talk about it, because then you're not trying to say that you understand it or that you're going through what they're going through. If you are, then by all means use that.
I suppose you could say like I understand you're angry, like, but not I understand what you're going through, because you never will. You're not in their shoes, right?
And if they're just really angry, if they're already amped up at like a 10, they still might just challenge that, even if you do genuinely understand. Like, let's say the program you cut, your own kid is in that program. You're like, no, genuinely, I do understand because I had to go home and tell my kid about this. They still may not be able to hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So talking about those conversations, share the facts. Start there. Usually there's things you can agree did or didn't happen, and I use it a lot as a principle about like what happened on the playground. Okay, this happened, and first you don't talk about the part you disagree on. If we're talking about an event or something where there's different opinions, like okay, what do we agree happened? And you start there, because usually that also works as a de-escalation strategy, because if you're just talking about facts without emotions and stuff, sometimes it brings people down. And then, assuming in this situation that like 2 and 3 you'll switch back and forth depending on the situation, but sometimes you'll tell your story, so you'll say these are the facts, and like we agree on these facts, and you'll be like, this is how I see the information, And then you talk tentatively, so you'll tell your story and you'll be like, is there something I'm missing? Is there a piece of information that you have that I don't? Or do you interpret this information differently? And you let them tell it. And that's where the ask for the other's path is. You kind of move between the two. Because what you're trying to do is get them talking so you understand where they're at. So that you have that information. Because like I said, a lot of times people will go off in left or right field and they're yelling at you and they're not actually even talking about what they're upset about, or they're so hyper-focused on one thing that they're not really focusing on the important issue. Encourage testing. So when you share that story, you pause and say, does that seem reasonable to you? Is that a logical conclusion with the information that you have? Do you have a different explanation? Because you want them engaged. You want them talking. You want them to know that you're listening, that you're trying to create shared understanding. And avoid falling into traps. So ignoring the body language, if they're amping up and they're like, I'm fine, and you just barrel ahead, that can be a trap. Make sure that you don't fall into like violent strategies of like, okay, you need to do this or else, and then barreling through that. Even perks like offering awards and stuff, because like when those things are removed, the conversation, like you're not really coming to a conclusion. If you're dealing with a series of events, focus on a pattern. Try not to get, again, drilled down in real specifics. And like I said, it's okay to stop the conversation. Okay, here's some ways to get people talking, so strategies, and we had a great discussion about that. One is ask, usually if you're in a crucial conversation already, that the person's probably needs a little bit more than that. But I will say, since we're in the day of social media, don't do ask with text, email, that sort of stuff. Call the person up, because better yet, meet, because then you can read the body language, you can read the tone of voice, you get a lot of information. I think you can all agree when you get an email, it's free range to interpret however you want. I don't care how good you're at communication, you can write one thing and have people come to wildly different conclusions, which generally is based on their perspective. One thing, not to gloss over, but we had very good discussion there. I really generally do, it's hard to think of it as it's their problem, not yours. Like a lot of times when people come at you, there's a temptation to internalize it, you need to fix it, to take that on personally. A lot of times that angry conversation is a reflection of their state. And if you can keep your state of mind realizing that it's about like they're expressing their experience, their perspective, and they might be attacking you with it, but like it's usually not a reflection of you. It's usually their own personal circumstance. For an example, I knew a parent once who came in and they often got upset with the teacher, and they were a single mom, and we'd have conversations. So I eventually learned like a teacher would make a comment about like spending enough time on homework, or you didn't help your kid enough or something like that. Basically like you need to help the kid more. And she'd come in like real hot, and I learned that like she was dealing with people gossiping about what she did at the bar and telling her that she was a bad parent. And the reason she was coming in hot was that she felt like her identity as a mom was being challenged. And it was usually better if she came and talked to me, because I'd go through these things and you'd come down. But like if you handle that incorrectly, you won't know why that person's going into you. And then when you have understanding, most of the time you can bring them down. It doesn't work on everybody. I'll be honest about that. But like if the person is honest about what their intent is, that they want to solve a problem, that there's this thing that's upsetting them, you can usually work through quite a bit of it to at least have an understanding. And I'll have some caveats on the end to that. So mirror, I mentioned that a little bit. So sometimes if a person's shutting down or they're angry, you'll just tell them what you're seeing. It'll be like, one time I saw a staff member taking out garbage, and the reason that was interesting was, that was a custodial job. So I stopped and I said, I see you're taking out garbage. And then I heard Well, it never gets done, da 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 da. And what you're trying to do is, and it does work, you tell the person, I see how you're doing, and then you invite them to explain why, and be prepared for that to be an upset explanation. But sometimes that act of saying, I see how you're responding, makes people open up a little bit. Paraphrase, that is a good one to use when somebody's telling you their story, but don't repeat it word for word. Sometimes people take that as mocking, for one. And two, you want to really use your own words, because the example I like to use is that one of my family members, when they say table, they mean all flat surfaces in the house. And so sometimes we have a misunderstanding where I'll go look for the thing, and I can't find it because it's not on the table, it's on the counter. And so even that little thing, if I paraphrase back, I use the same words, I'm not going to catch that I have a different understanding. So that's an important thing. Prime the pump. This is not one you generally go straight to. This is one where you go to when you know the person isn't opening up, you know there's a problem, and you want to learn about it. So you take a guess. So maybe you're talking about the cut program, the parents coming to you and they're telling you you're an awful board member, and you say something like, I hear that you're saying that you don't think I listen, that I just do whatever the superintendent says. By chance, are you upset that they cut this program? Because that's, and what you're trying to do is redirect them to what the real problem is. Sometimes you guess wrong, so that's why it's not like a first go-to. I have used it, and it can work. My most interesting story with it was with a para once. I had brought them in. The reason I brought them in was for some reason they were sending all these kids to the counselor that didn't ask to go to the counselor to talk about their feelings about the principal. And so I sat them down and I played it this way. I said, here's my facts, and we went through them. And at the end of that, she said, well, are you accusing me of anything? I said, no, but like, do you agree this is what happened? And like, yes. And I said, okay, if you were me, what would you think of it? And she quit, so I assumed that she thought I would think well of it. So that's not the objective, but I was letting her provide the explanation. She couldn't come up with one. It can play out different ways, and a lot of times you kind of have to move back and forth. And having that smart friend to talk it through is really helpful, because these are skills. They take time to build. And like your instinct in the situation is probably none of this. Your instinct is, I want to fight, I want to run, I want to freeze, and your thoughts are probably going down to me right, you wrong. So like sometimes you have to give yourself space or them space to come back to a more rational state of mind. Because if you're both amped up and you start going into it, I can guarantee nothing good's going to happen. One time. So agree where you agree. This may sound counterintuitive, or maybe it makes the most sense to you. Most of the time when we disagree on something, we actually agree on like 80 or 90%, and it's the 10 or 20% that we want to have a battle about. And sometimes if you start with, I agree here, you agree here. An example I have it, once I had a staff meeting, we're going to have a talk about a reading program. And I took a survey beforehand about like what people agreed. And one of the staff members came, they had like a whole speech written. And I said, these were the areas where you agree. And she was like, oh, okay. And we got a lot more done because she didn't need the speech. And a lot of times we get hung up and we don't realize even where we agree. Dialogue is not decision making. Just to be aware of that. Like, sometimes this is very cathartic and you can build relationships, but it's kind of a separate thing to talk about, okay, what are we going to do now? So you don't want to have a crucial conversation about the same topic every day, so that's why that's up there. So if there's something that you're deciding to do, make sure you understand it and that you talk about that. And pay attention to follow through. That's really the same thing, because sometimes you have this conversation and the person thinks you're going to do X and you don't, and so they think you completely ignored them, and that was not your understanding. I remember one time I had a conversation with one of our local businesses. They were upset about a contract we entered into. They called me, and I thought I explained pretty well that we signed it. I understand that you don't support them, and these are the reasons. It was like a 3-year one, and so later he called me again because they were doing something with this, and he was like very upset, like saying, you don't listen to me or whatever. I'm like, okay, I understand where you're at, but we're in a 3-year agreement. When it ends, we can have this conversation again. And at this point, we haven't revisited it. But like, he obviously thought I was going to go and like cancel the contract or something. I'm like, well, that's not one of the options I have. So paying attention to follow through. I'm sure that you would agree that these are usually kind of exhausting to have. And so it helps you not to have them over and over again. Be clear on how you make decisions. I'm going to do this one a little bit fast. So know who is involved in the decision. Know who has an interest and those sorts of things. And you work with your administration quite a bit, but there's 4 different types of decisions to make. One is command. That's where you're an emergency. We're going to do this. I'm telling you to do this because I'm the person that has the information. Don't use another strategy if that's what's going on, because then it looks insincere and it will actually damage relationships. Consult, like you're making a school calendar. You get everybody's opinion on it. But no, you can't give everybody who wants this particular Friday off because they have a vacation plan. You can't work all that into the calendar, right? Sometimes when you do stuff like that, you are very clear this isn't a vote. This is how it's being used. Sometimes doing that up front avoids conflict. Vote as just a democratic process. If you need, you guys engage in votes a lot, so. And consensus. Consensus, I only recommend using. That's where you try to get everybody to agree on it. And it's very important that you have high buy-in and that everybody goes along. I one time had a decision about the curriculum where I went with consensus because I needed everybody to go and implement the curriculum, obviously. I actually agreed with one of the teachers that wanted to go a different route, and I had a conversation with her like, I understand, I actually agree with you, but if I go this route, I'm not going to get these people doing it, and then it won't work, and they'll tell you the thing about like, see, I told you it didn't work, and so almost anything won't work if you don't carry it out with fidelity. So some caveats. It's hard to make these work if the person's focused on winning. Same goes for you. But if their only objective is to prove you're wrong, you're a demon, whatever, like it's hard to have a calm conversation about it. So if it's that, you try to get them onto like something else. But sometimes that's difficult. The relationship needs repair first. So one time I had a pair of teachers where this was going on. Through a course of series of events, one was a special ed teacher, one was a classroom teacher. He was pulling a student out of the class, and they were kind of taken as disrespect because it was always their class, as you saw the schedule. And to make the story quick, it kind of divulged, and they started butting heads. And so I started meeting with them every week and forcing them to sit together, and we eventually got to a point where we repaired the relationship and we could work together. We still disliked each other, but we weren't having the big arguments and fights anymore. So sometimes you need to go back to the relationship, especially if there's a high level of disrespect and trust. Well, if those things aren't present, sometimes you have to go back to figuring out why it's not there, especially if it's 2 people that have to work together regularly. When things turn adversarial, so I have a different presentation called Courage Under Fire. It's kind of similar to the first one. When people are no longer acting in good faith, it's difficult to use these to try to solve the problem. And what good faith doesn't, or bad faith doesn't mean that the person agrees or disagrees with you or that they're being reasonable or unreasonable. It means that they're being honest about what they want. They're being transparent about what they're trying to get and how they feel about it. When people start lying about what it is that they're trying to accomplish and they start using other strategies, sometimes you're not going to be able to talk your way out of that. That becomes a different problem. And sometimes in those situations, you have to switch to protecting yourself.
I know it's a word that is sensitive anymore, that people don't like it, but it's just, I think it's so important to have empathy when you're approaching this. It's really important to try to meet people where they are.
Yeah, and honestly, like, especially you guys as board members or schools, if you're having these conversations in a healthy manner, that's good. Like, you're not supposed to agree on everything. You're supposed to have feelings. You care about your kids, you care about the school, and sometimes you'll have differing opinions, and sorting through that in a healthy way is good. Obviously, sorting through it in an unhealthy way is not good for anybody, and I think we all agree on that.
And I think it's important, like, when you have the close vote, that even though if someone's coming at you and saying, I didn't agree with that, and I see you voted against it too, at that point you have to be like, but I did vote against it, but I understand their point of view. You know what I mean? Because you don't want to be, because then you're kind of playing them against the other board members. You have to be careful about that too.
Yeah, and you guys will, and me as a superintendent, I'll face that too, where you maybe don't agree with your decision as a board and or administrative team or whatever it is, and it won't help if you're like, it's their fault and I'm on my own. For one, everybody who disagrees is going to come to you. Maybe it feels good that people come talk to you, but it won't be a healthy thing. Plus, you want people to have your back when the decision's in your favor too.
I think it's important that in some difficult conversations, people just want to be heard, and it's important that leaders, they don't have to solve everything, just be that sounding board, and how important that is at times, rather than trying to solve everything. Because that's when I jump to a lot. I got to solve this. I got to take care of this. And really, all they wanted was to be heard.
Yeah, and we're all like in leadership roles, and we're used to solving problems. And sometimes the person just wants the catharsis of getting the feelings out. It's not always fun to be the person that gets put on, but sometimes if you go through it, then the person, that's what they really wanted. And we're all human. Like, these are hard to have, and a lot of times you have feelings too. So like, if you're in one and you handle it poorly, it's okay. Maybe you're going to deal with something that's not okay, but like, you have feelings. It's okay that you have feelings. It's okay that you got upset, like, with the caveat there. But like, don't beat yourself too much over it, because this is hard. Like, when your emotions get high, you want to fight or freeze, like I said. And there'll be times that you get it wrong. And if you keep trying to improve, you'll get better at it. If you just beat yourself up, you'll feel really crappy for one, and you probably won't develop the skill to get through it anyway. Thank you very much.